Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves, Eric Stone, and the show's guests. The content provided is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Please consult a healthcare professional for any medical questions. The views and opinions expressed are our own and do not represent those of our workplaces. Listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content does not establish a doctor-patient relationship.
All right, we are back today with a special guest that Eric has brought in. So I'll let you introduce our amazing guest today.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm so excited. Today's gonna be so fun. So I actually have my sister on today, Lindsay Stone. So Lindsay has worked in the news and media industry for quite some time. So Lindsay, I don't want to shortchange you. I know you've worked in three different areas: South Bend, Indiana, for a few years, Indianapolis for a few years, and now you are back in our hometown of Cincinnati, covering the news. And so I say, Lindsay, I don't want to like shortchange you. I know things kind of change sometimes, but what's your current role like with the news industry?
So right now I'm the weekend anchor at Channel 5, and then I'm also a part-time reporter. So on the weekends, I'm in the studio anchoring the news, and then 3 days of the week, I am out in the field. So that means for an entire day, I'm covering one story, and that could be a variety of topics, from sports to politics. And if you watch the news, you know if it bleeds, it leads. It's a lot of crime. So very exposed to a lot of what's going on in the area. It's a pretty wide DMA, but a lot of the shootings, murders, that sort of thing, the things that make the news, we are covering that pretty heavily.
Well, I appreciate what you do for our community and what you do. And so, one of the things I just want to say, like, Lindsay is obviously my sister, and I love her, and I would endorse her for everything. But also, she is extremely talented as a reporter and has done a lot of pieces on mental health. And so, I will try not to cry in saying this, but I hear a lot about Lindsay's stories with the veteran outreach in Butler County, and I want to say, Lindsay, thank you for pushing through what you have, because I know it's been challenging sometimes to get some of those stories out. But there is a story about a woman who completed veteran treatment court in Butler County who had been in the life for 30 years, and she was willing to share her story. And Lindsay also has covered lots of different things for veteran mental health and just mental health in general. So I would say Lindsay is uniquely qualified to speak on this as our trauma podcast. So Lindsay, Tiffany and I kind of, we don't play, we have our podcast, but we don't pretend that we're reporters and journalists. But if you don't mind, we've got some questions prepared just to kind of ask you.
Do it.
Uh, so, what kind of first drew your attention to kind of the issue of like trauma in the workplace as it kind of impacted you being a reporter, being on some of these scenes, and having to cover some of these stories in great detail?
I realized that we didn't have a lot of time to decompress. It was news of the day, we're out at a scene, you're fielding a lot. You're oftentimes at a shooting, the victims' families are showing up. So you're hearing the cries, the screams, the grief. You are also trying to balance getting, information from officials who might have just seen a body or something really traumatic themselves. And so I
Mm,
realized we do that all in a day's work. And then I go home and I'm supposed to flip a switch and go to my personal life and eat dinner and move on with my life. And then I wake up the next morning and it's the next scene, the next family that's forever impacted by whatever that moment is.
mm,
In this job, you often are meeting people in the worst moment of their lives. And I realized it was like the repetition of there wasn't a lot of break in between. We were out at stories, we were out at scenes, go to bed, wake up, do it all again. And I kind of realized that while we often cover great stories, and I appreciate, Eric, your kind words, we were talking a lot about mental health in the field and mental health support for veterans or young adults or all these different things. I realized that we weren't talking a lot about mental health for us and what we were experiencing day in and day out. Much like psychologists and doctors, we do see traumatic things. And I realized there needed to be more emphasis on the kind of processing that part of it, so it didn't bleed into our personal lives at all.
Yeah. Do you feel like, Lindsay, there's kind of this wanting to be seen as tough or gritty, so kind of like earning of stripes, so to speak, or like that's just comes with the territory, like you just have to be able to hashtag air quotes deal with it, so to speak? Is that kind of the culture sometimes in your field?
I could totally see that. Maybe not as much in like first responders or those who are serving our country. I think it's maybe more ingrained in that process when I talk to veterans or people that are first responders. But I think there certainly is a almost emotional resiliency that you're supposed to have. This isn't your family. We don't know them. It just kind of compartmentalized. And I think I remember one of my first few months in this business, I'd met a murder victim's family and I was crying right along with them. And someone told me afterwards in the station, don't worry, it gets easier. And I thought, well, I hope it never does, because then I'm desensitized to what's actually going on. And so I think there is definitely, like you said, Eric, a get through it, be tougher mentality. But I think it's also a lack of empathy sometimes we seem to have, trying to just process. That's like almost like our defense mechanism. Like, it's just on to the next. There's more news tomorrow, kind of a vibe.
Yeah. Tiffany, anything you want to add on this? I know I've got like a pretty strong list I'm kind of going, but I don't want to hog the mic today because I can see myself getting excited with some of these questions.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little curious in terms of like, this sounds like a really hard job where you have to switch quite frequently as compared to us where we get to sit in it. Um, is there anything that your workplace or your training does to like prepare you for like the whirlwind of day-to-day like craziness?
I don't know that there's anything prevention wise. Like, I don't know that I got a crash course when I got to the station about how to deal with this, whether that's any station. I've been at 3 stations now. So I don't think I had any sort of guidance to do it, initiation by fire perhaps, but it certainly now the station I work for, Channel 5, we take mental health really seriously. So they offer 8 free counseling sessions per year. So there's a lot of great resources. There's a lot of mental health resources on our corporate website with Hearst. They've made this such a priority because they have really started to recognize that we are in these traumatic situations and seeing a lot of things. So Hearst has been incredible. Channel 5 has been incredible. Definitely on the post part of like after an event, they're fantastic. But I do think there's more that we can be doing as a culture, not just in my workplace, to really address the preventative. Like, how do we handle this? For me, I love working out. That's been my stress relief. But some people, that's not theirs. And so I think I would have loved to, in college, try to figure out what is my stress relief look like? What are the outlets? Because as you guys know, you're sitting in it, like you just said, Tiffany. Like you have to have a way to process it for sure.
Wow. Wow. Man, I mean, I've seen you in different seasons of your life, and I think I would agree that you are thriving and doing really well. And it seems like that support is um, so helpful. Um, I guess maybe one of the things I would ask, we talk about like how us therapists are trained, and sometimes we're not even taught for how to really handle the realities of this job. Do you feel like your journalism classes or preparation classes or just any of that classwork, do you feel like it prepared you for some of this, or kind of said, hey, you're going to have to adjust to some of this? Or was there any kind of preparation before you got into the job with the before the job training?
Probably more from internships than schoolwork. And Eric and I both went to the same university, and it was a much smaller university. It didn't have a broadcasting major. There was journalism, so there was some exposure to, like, you'll tell different kinds of stories. I don't think it was until my first internship in college when I was on the side of the road at a crash scene and I saw a body with a white sheet over it. I was like 20 years old. I was like, oh, oh, it's like this. I think that was my first exposure. I always thought the media was pushed way back and you didn't see as much. So that was kind of like, wow.
Mm,
So I don't know that I got that in school, to be honest, Eric. I don't think I had that mindfulness until I was really in it. And there certainly wasn't a conversation. I'm in year 7 of my career. There wasn't a conversation in school about, hey, this might be stressful. Here's how to deal with it. It really was just when we would go through different, training for a new job, campus jobs Eric and I were a part of, they talk about stress management. It was almost like stress management concepts, not like mental health concepts, if you know what I mean. It was like, here's how to balance being stressed at
yeah.
work. It wasn't really about like, here's how to check in on your mental health and here's how to handle that. I really have learned so much from being in the job. And I'm so blessed to have a brother in the mental health space and a
Oh,
sister-in-law who's brilliant. So I've learned a lot just from asking you guys questions, if anything.
well, that was kind, and I'll settle up with you later. I paid up for some of these compliments, just a few of them. But
Sponsor
I
me.
think you're onto something there, Lindsay, because it just seems like almost like either there's not an ability to understand some of these things until we've experienced some of them, and so I think that's really common for like personally going through a trauma or witnessing a trauma, and so it sounds like maybe your industry is kind of similar to ours, where you kind of get seasoned, so to speak. And sad to say this, you kind of either find your way of managing that and you can continue, or you don't and you don't make it. And so one of the stats I throw out sometimes is that the average therapist tenure is like 2.5 to 3 years is the average amount of kind of expectancy for people to be therapists, which it's such a shocking stat because grad school is at least 2 years and you have to have an undergrad degree. So, um, kind of just translating that back to your field, Lindsay, do you feel like it is a tough industry on people's mental health and just kind of finding a way of managing the demands and impact of the work that they're doing?
1,000%. And I think it's twofold. I think one part of it is the content. The other part of it is the lifestyle. I don't watch any of those shows like Newsroom or any of the other like news shows because I'm in it. So I'm like, I already live this.
Mm,
But I hear it shows a good side of like how cutthroat the industry is. It's long hours. You work every holiday. We work every shift. I used to work, Tiffany, like 2:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Like it was just crazy. So a lot of it is the lifestyle of news and not being able to get a lot of time off and having horrible hours and things like that. The other part I think is the content. I mean, it is heavy stuff. And I cling
mm,
on to those great stories of the little kid that beat cancer or the woman whose house burned down and everyone is on the money for. Like I love those stories, but the reality is a lot of time it is trying to keep communities safe. So we're highlighting the worst of it. So I think it's twofold. Yeah, I think there's a very low amount of people that stay in news more than 5 years. I started out with about 20 friends in news. We're down to 3 people who are in it in just 5 years.
wow.
Yeah, very. I don't know the stat like you do, but I'm sure
Yeah.
it's similar.
And that stat may be out of date. I try to always tell all new therapists that stat anytime I get to speak to a class or a prospective therapist when in training. I'm like, you've got to take care of yourself. And one of the things we've talked about in other episodes, but I think it's worth here, is that you can only put a cape on for so long. There's only so long you can pretend that you don't need fulfillment, you don't need self-care, you don't need rejuvenation. That's for the I'll call myself out. Oh, other people, like I'm called, I'm compelled. I don't need sleep. I don't need good nutrition. I don't need movement. I don't need time to reset my nervous system. When we all need that. And if you aren't doing that, it does pull from somewhere. And so Tiffany, you can add into this, but I think grad school is ridiculous, and I really try to have empathy for anyone in grad school because it's insane, and being a therapist is a lot. And I don't know, Lindsay, if this would be scary or not, but typically when we graduate with a master's degree, we've got a lot of a little bit of things and maybe a little bit on like how to run a session, but all those modalities that people want to come to therapy for, we kind of have to do that on our own. So it's kind of like, okay, we've got grad school, and it's almost like a new wave begins of like, okay, now I'm going to do EMDR, now I'm going to do DB. Now some people try to get it before, but it's I don't know, Tiffany, you can check me on this. I feel like it's almost impossible to get that done while you're in grad school because grad school has enough whether it's social work, marriage and family, or counseling. But I want to make sure I get your perspective too, Tiffany, because it's definitely not the only perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even want to think about grad school. It's one
Okay,
of those
block it
things that,
out.
yeah, when I think about it, I'm like, I don't know how I did it because I worked a part-time job. I did my internship and went to school at night and like still tried to take care of myself, but like in reality, probably wasn't taking care of myself. Just because it's so much pressure to like do school, do all the things, learn all the things. So like if someone is learning EMDR or DBT or something while they're in grad school, like please let me know where you get the extra like pause button because I would love to have the time to do that.
You know, I did get trained in grad school in EMDR, and when I look back on it, Tiffany, I was talking to like younger, newer therapists, and I literally was like, "Don't do that." Like, I honestly was like, "I don't know why I did that. I don't know how I did that." And then I looked back, I was like, "Oh yeah, because I was taking terrible care of myself." And so, kind of pinging it back to you, Lindsay, I'm sure like it's that hard to find the balance of like this could be a good opportunity, this could be good, like because it's almost limitless. I think for us therapists, like, oh, I could get this new modality, I could do this, I could go to a training, I could be a trainer, I could get like, I don't know what the equivalent would be for your industry, but is that hard to say no and not keep doing all the things or trying to grow as quick as possible?
I almost feel like the equivalent for us is just like so much more superficial, but it's almost going to events, emceeing things,
Mm,
making appearances. I think that's where we don't. I mean, there are certainly journalists that go to grad school and their writing is incredible. So I'm sure for some that really has paid off. It's not something that you need. We don't get really trained more and more. It's more about repetition, building your brand, that sort of thing. But I think there's always that, yeah, that difficulty of like time is so valuable. I think time is the most valuable resource we have because we don't know how much we have of it. So it is hard to navigate how much you say yes to, there's a great fundraiser and someone is so kind enough to invite you and want you to be there, but yet that's on an off day and you've got to prioritize your personal life. So I think that's where I feel the friction is like just trying to be out and about and represent Channel 5. And I've been given such a great opportunity in my hometown. So I want to be there, but I also need to, like you guys were saying, like take care of yourself. And I think, yeah, that's definitely a hard part. One of the things that I think, and I'd love to get your guys' perspective on, is often as news anchors, we like say we're like ducks. So on the surface,
mm,
we're very calm. Everything is just like
ooh,
great. We're in the show. Underneath the surface, it's like the feet are fluttering. There's people screaming in our ear. There's chaos around. There's breaking news, all of that. And I think it's helped me in some ways build a resiliency to be able to flip the switch. My life
mm,
could be chaotic and there could be so much going on, but I'll be very calm. And on like a personal note, Tiffany, like my early 20s were a really tumultuous time. And so my career was like taking off as my personal life was suffering. And every day I was just very like, you wouldn't know. People had no idea what was going on. And I think
mm,
in some ways, that's so incredible because you can build resiliency and that can be a great thing to just get through. I'm particularly thinking of other people who have it much harder, like single moms and people with health issues. Like there's no other way but forward. But I think it can also be, Eric used the word mask. Like it can be this negative. And I'm curious, like, what are the dangers of having that ability to flip the switch on and off? And what are maybe if there are benefits? And I'd love to
mm.
hear your guys' opinions on that.
I know Tiffany has something ready to go.
I mean, it can be beneficial, like if you have a switch to be like, okay, I'm like done. I- If you have that ability to hard compartmentalize that, it's probably not like your work and personal life probably don't enmesh emotionally as much as like others. But I mean, I would argue that's probably not the average person. We don't have like an on-off switch. So being able to like I always talk about incorporating like transition pillows for people, like giving yourself X amount of time, like before or after work, to mentally like decompress
Mm,
or shift, whether that's listening to music or talking out loud to yourself or writing down what happened. So you can kind of leave it there rather than letting it like eat away at you. I always think about it as I like have a game-based brain. So like I think about it as Pac-Man. Like if we're the ghost, we don't want Pac-Man to catch up, so we need to keep adding like different little things for it to get in the way.
I
ooh,
love that
I
word
like
picture.
that. Yeah. Um, I think we're all wired differently, and I guess I just come to like we're all trying to survive the best we can, and so there is some benefit to being able to disassociate and block out or switch. I think that's more common, like you've identified, Lindsay, in maybe some of the higher intensity industries, like the media, first responders, medical, hopefully therapy. We can do this, but yeah, I think it can be helpful. I think the challenge can be the numbness that can come by being able to flip a switch. And so something that got me started with personal therapy is I found out one of my clients died by overdose. And it just, and I'm sad to say this, in the moment, I didn't have any physical sensations. I didn't have any emotional thoughts, but it was just this numbness, like I walked into a big fridge and I just was numb all over my body. And I'm grateful I knew that that wasn't the way that I should be responding to that. And so I went to therapy and was able to work through some of those things and find ways of feeling for my patients and clients and also being able to be a human being. So, yeah, I see how the switch is helpful. And then I also can see like there's been moments where maybe I've flipped that switch too many times. And then there's like the payout later of like total numbness. Yeah, I don't mean to go too far off, but I can see how it's helpful. I see it in my own patients and some of the intensities, but I also would argue like there's a reason our brains adapt to do that sometimes, and it's because it is advantageous in some situations to do that to get through difficult moments or difficult seasons.
Yeah, I think when I've relied on it, it almost like delays the processing. So I've tried to speed up that flipping back on to not kind of put something off later. But it's challenging. I mean, particularly, I remember Christmas Eve this year, Tiffany, I was spending the whole day talking to the family of a 12-year-old who had been murdered. And I remember just like it was such a hard day. And I was heading right to our family's Christmas Eve dinner. And I was like already running late. And I just had the whole 45-minute drive. I was like bawling to my dad on the phone because I was like, I don't want to get there. I don't want to ruin the vibe. I was like, I'm so upset. And it was just like, I needed, I think what you were talking about, that buffer period of like, I needed to confide in someone. I needed to share. And it was helpful. I think we were able to move on with the night. But yeah, I think it's trying to remember like some of the things we do see are traumatic. And I think sometimes it's like we try to, like Eric said earlier, like be like, oh, it's fine. Like we're good. We can get through this. But it's like, I think I'm not acknowledging it almost does more harm than good.
Well, and I also know that there's just like a big um challenge of trying to be authentic and cope and real, but also like try to do our jobs. And we all obviously it's a calling. Like there are lots of jobs that you could do similar things and make similar amounts of money either way. So it is a calling, I think, on both ends. But I do just want to compliment media and just validate, like I think I'm getting to hear about things never right on the scene. I'm hearing about them maybe a week later, months later, years later, some of the details from the person's perspective. I am not confronting images, video, and then having to like summarize that and then really know it to speak about it. I think that is just another level of sitting with something. Yeah, I don't know, Tiffany, what you'd say to that, but I would just say when I'm doing trauma therapy, EMDR, I'm in some of it, but I don't know if I'm ever all of the pieces around something with some of that.
Yeah, I would say we kind of get the softer version versus Lindsay, I imagine, gets the hard smack of the brutal front page that she softens for everyone.
Yeah, there's a lot of like exposure, like my email inbox. Like the one of the hardest topics for me, and I know this is like we can take this part out because I know we're getting on the fringes here, but the hardest things for me to stomach are crimes against children, and that's something that I just it makes me nauseous. I don't like to cover, particularly after becoming an aunt. It's something that I almost like will physically make me ill, and we get a lot of like the documents that are so graphic, and it's like we can't air almost any of that in the news. It's so horrible, but yet someone has to make the decision. Like someone has to read it, someone has to decide what we can use, and And it is a lot of exposure. So it's things as heavy as that. It's things, y'all remember Harambe? There was raw video of the poor little boy getting dragged and Harambe being killed. And like, we all had to see that and decide how much do we use. And so it is a lot of, like you were saying, Tiffany, like it's a lot of like, we see it all and then we decide to filter what we can share. And some stuff I do purposely like leave out because it's so horrible. Not anything that would take away from the credibility of the story, but like, some details when we're sitting with families who are going through something so horrible. Like, particularly, like I can think of an example where she was like, our last phone call, he said this XYZ, and like, we had plans to do this just next week, or things like that would just like gut you more than the situation. Like things like that I like don't want to expose people to because it's so hard for me to even process. So it is hard to use that discretion and see some of that. Yeah.
Wow. I think you've kind of already shared some of this, Lindsay, but can you share any stories that have like really stuck with you involving someone kind of navigating their exposure to trauma in the workplace? Can you think of any? I know you've kind of given a lot of examples, but is there any particular story that kind of sticks out to you?
A story about mental health or like a colleague dealing with mental health?
Either one. I could see both being very impactful. So either one, wherever your brain kind of goes with that question.
I've certainly had some coworkers take mental health leaves. I've had some coworkers who, after we cover something, they'll take maybe a day or two off. Especially because we're often, when it's something really horrible, we're there for several days in a row. The example that comes to mind is in Claremont County, there was a father who murdered his 3 young children. We were there every day for 2 weeks, and you get that like news fatigue because you're just talking to the same people, hearing the same story, and it just you become like so desensitized to it. And I think for news people, we have a pretty good mindfulness when we are getting that news fatigue. And particularly, I work for an incredible news director who can sense that and will put someone else on the story when they feel like we're getting too exposed to something. So I feel like I've got a great layer of protection that I just haven't had before. So I'm really grateful for that. So I think that's like an example of, like some people have had to kind of decompress after. And then certainly with the work I do now, mental health is an ongoing journey. I was just doing a story last week, the one that Eric was talking about earlier, about there's a woman whose husband died by suicide, and he was a firefighter for 26 years. He thought he had PTSD. He did all the right things, went to the hospital, got all the tests, and they thought he had a substance disorder. And so he said, no, drinking isn't the thing, but I'll stop drinking to prove it to you. And so he did. He stopped cold turkey. He still had all these symptoms, and then ended up committing suicide. And it was really sad because he did have PTSD. And so, this poor woman was left a widow with 6 kids, and she was just navigating all of that with me and talking about it and turning her pain into purpose, helping others. So, but you can tell when we were talking about it, even though she had started this incredible foundation to help other first responders with PTSD, you can still see the wounds of what happened to her have not healed. This was 6 years ago, and she's done so much good, but like, she's a mom of 6 kids that's a widow. I don't know that she's had time to process. And so like, we were having this great conversation about mental health, about her own mental health, and I think that's something that I admire so much from what you guys both do is, sometimes it feels like pouring from an empty cup. Like, you have to take care of your mental health because you're caring for so many other people, but that doesn't mean that you're perfect. It doesn't mean that I'm perfect. We can still be battling with our own mental health while trying to help others with their mental health. And I think that was something I've learned in this job is, no one's ever perfect. No one's at 100%. And that's why we can give to others. Often we are fluctuating, and trying to get that toughness is difficult. And I admire so much of what you guys do because, it's so repetitive. It's day after day of listening and being supportive and resources. And I mean, I feel like you guys have such a difficult job, and we're so grateful you exist to support us.
Well, likewise, honestly. I mean, I've said this to Lindsay before, Tiffany, but it's like, we are one-on-one in some sessions and talking about awareness and prevention, and then Lindsay can go do a story that's seen by, I don't know how many million people. I don't know. I don't know what the stats or numbers are. I should have prepped for that. I could have. I think we're a top 25 market, but I don't remember how many eyes you get on each story. But I do think it is challenging, but really appreciate what you are doing and sharing and just, we're kind of in that halfway point of like what we're going over right now. But just really appreciate you taking the time, Lindsay. I know it's not, like you said, it's a resource that is very busy. And so we really appreciate like your lens because when Tiffany and I were talking about this, I think we want to recognize other industries that also face trauma, like therapy is one thing, but also we are not the only field, of course, that faces trauma and challenges in the workplace. And so some of the goals of the podcast is to challenge stigma around mental health, but also just work on trauma. And I think workplace trauma is certainly a thing. So it may not have changed, but one of the questions I was really curious about is how do you see your industry, maybe how they respond to mental health when you first started, whether that's a story or how they support staff versus maybe today in 2025. It sounds like right now, really healthy, supportive environment. Like, have you seen any trends or maybe heard from colleagues? Obviously, de-identified, of course, anything that you've noticed or seen kind of shift in the industry.
Yeah, I think when I started and people were raising questions about mental health and the support, I felt there was like this gap between the rookies and the people who had been there for a long time. And when the rookies were sounding the alarm about like, hey, like I think this is really traumatic, maybe we could have a debrief or some sort of support. It felt like the older people were like, you guys are weak, you guys are not as tough, we've done this, and I think in a lot of areas, I know Tiffany, you're nodding along. Like I think in a lot of areas that example persists. Like I think a lot of the older people are like looking to the younger ones saying like you're weak, you're whatever. And in reality, I think some of these younger people are just realizing that there's room to grow and that we need support and that, vulnerability is strength. It's not weakness. And so I certainly felt that discretion, that like big gap, that disparity more in the beginning. And I think now it feels like we've caught up a little bit, at least with my coworkers now. They've never like looked at a younger person sounding the alarm about like, hey, this is a little traumatic by like, oh, you're a young, weak person. I think they're starting to understand a little bit more how difficult the job can be. It just feels like the older generation who has definitely grit and bear it, like I think they are understanding that it's not coming from a place of weakness. It's actually strength.
Wow. Tiffany, I feel like I could just hog the mic, so I'm really trying not to today, but I don't mean to pause. I feel like I could go off really easily here and keep asking. Is there any direction you'd like to take this conversation, Tiffany?
There's not really any direction I would like to take it specifically, but I do think that it is important to note that like there is that disparaging difference of like older individuals are like, oh, put your head in the sand and just keep moving forward. And I'm like, we've hit a lot of things because our heads are in the sand. We probably should pay attention to what we're doing.
Yeah, on so many different industries too. Like I know like physicians and doctors when they were doing residency, they were working like 72-hour shifts or something crazy. And like now they're like, oh, you should probably sleep every 24 hours. And like I think about like now I'm like, rested doctors make fewer mistakes. Like that seems like a good thing because someone sounded the alarm and was like, maybe we should sleep. And I'm sure the first person that said that might have been, like looked at like, oh, they're weak, they can't handle it. But it's like I do think in a lot of industries we're making strides towards, just taking care of ourselves, both physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. And I think that's really good. And maybe in the beginning there's some pushback. And I think sometimes I will say I think we are a little soft sometimes in some areas in our culture. I think we could be a little tougher, but I think when it comes to mental health and emotional health, I think we're making such great strides. And I think there's so much more work to do, but I think it doesn't feel as taboo as it used to be, which I think is great.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. I love this discussion. One thing, Lindsay, I've noticed, and I want to give a shout out to WLWT. I've really noticed like a real shift in language talking about people impacted by addiction, people in recovery, people having like mental health crises when the stories do need to be covered. And so I guess maybe one question, as much as you can share, of course, like, are there discussions about the language being used maybe in some of these stories of some of these events? And as much as I know you can't share, I don't mean to get too much behind the curtain, but like the
No.
dialogue, the words used in some of the stories or releases.
Absolutely. One phrase that we are using is they died by suicide versus
Oh,
committed suicide.
wonderful.
And so that was like an ongoing discussion. And maybe even earlier in my language, just speaking freely, I might forget that often, because when I started, we were supposed to say committed suicide, and now the language has changed. So I think I'm still rewiring my brain. So I apologize if I earlier said, committed suicide, but certainly as a station, we've decided to move forward just saying died by suicide. And so there's a lot of conversation about the language we use, particularly when there are people in the LGBTQ community, making sure that we understand their pronouns, that we aren't saying anything that would be offensive or triggering. There's a lot of conversations about that. And obviously just there's an element of respect that we want to make sure we give to individuals. I think there was a sense, I'm talking like decades ago, some victim blaming, particularly when there were crimes committed against sex workers. I felt like the language was really disparaging, and we try to very much be mindful of that and keep it on the victim. And this is someone's daughter or son. This isn't just a sex worker. This isn't just, because we would never say, I mean, maybe we'd say like, oh, a teacher has been killed or something, but we are not just one thing. Our identities are so many, multifaceted. So it's definitely a conversation in our newsroom, particularly about the right language that we use, respecting people's pronouns and beliefs, and all those different things.
And that's really profound, and that has such an impact. Just as a therapist who sits with people, and Tiffany and I talk a lot about the algorithm, and it doesn't have to be a negative thing. The algorithm can help get that veteran suicide prevention article that you shared to the right people in the right spot. So, and it kind of leads me a little bit, but thank you for the work you do, genuinely. Like, I know it sounds kind of silly, but like just even the words you guys put in those releases, or the little, Facebook, there's the little article, like little summary thing, and you can read it, like that stuff shapes it. And I want to say, as a substance use counselor, I really appreciate how you guys talk about overdoses and surviving of overdoses, and not maybe doing the clickbaity stuff of taking a mugshot and putting it out. Like I really appreciate that. I appreciate the balance of people in recovery and like having those stories shared. I think just as like someone that gets to sit with a lot of people in our area in recovery, I know that's really meaningful to see that representation of their journey and stories, because so many of them are afraid to share their stories because they think what people will think of is like someone with their mugshot committing things, not, hey, I'm 5 years in recovery, I go to my kids' parent-teacher meetings, and I have a job, and I also enjoy a good cup of coffee. I'm a person. I'm not just this season of my life. So whatever that's worth, seriously, thank you. It has an impact every day. One of the things that I think, kind of building off that a bit about wording and language, is that media has been under attack for the last, I would say, the entire time you've been in the field, Lindsay. There's been a big shift of we are not, I don't know what we are as a podcast of however many people we have, but we really appreciate the media and the use it can have, and so we do not attack media here. But I know that frequently all of your colleagues are, and so I would just want to maybe ask, like, how has that been for you? Because I could see that being a very traumatic event for anyone in your industry right now having to deal with.
Yeah, great question. I think on the national level, we know which outlets lean which ways. On the local level, it is the most independent, like unbiased it can be. And I think because of the conversation around media, people still think that there's a bias there. And certainly we have to do our own checks and balances. And that has to happen. And luckily I look for a newsroom that we, even during election season, if we were going to do a story on an issue, we would time down to the second how much sound bite or sound time we were giving to both sides. So if I gave 45 seconds to someone for an issue, I had to give 45, not 43, not 47, 45 seconds on the other side. And that's how intentional we are. But yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, it was so interesting. My mom was in working for a school board. My dad was a physician. My brother was in the mental health field. And I was in media. And overall, my brother and my dad were seen as heroes. They were psychologists and they were doctors. They were getting freebies. Everyone was like discounted at McDonald's. Like, it was crazy. I, working for the media, was like, horrible. You're the worst. And I was like, I'm living alone. I'm like literally like quarantining by myself. I'm going to work every day. Never had a day where I've never worked from home, even during the pandemic. I was still going in, putting myself at risk, going into hospitals to tell the stories that mattered. And I was like, oh my gosh, people think I'm the
Wow.
villain. So that I think was the worst time for me. One, because it was a pandemic and all of us were just like, what the heck is going on? But two, because it felt like there were like two sides of the coin. There were like the heroes and the villains, and I was on the villain side, no matter how good my intentions were. I think now it's hard because there is such a discord towards media. And I just want to say, to be honest, some of it is rightly there. People are charged with crimes. We put their mugshot out. We say police have arrested them for this, this, and this. Their neighbors give a soundbite. Oh my gosh, Joe Smith did this, and it's so horrible. And in a lot of ways, we're almost convicting them in a court of public opinion. I'm thinking of the OJ trial. I'm thinking of all these things like public perception in media has weight to it. And so with these people are found not guilty and they didn't do this, I have to stand okay with the fact that I did a story. It's got to have, I've got to be okay with what I'm putting out. And so, to be honest, like I want to, obviously I work for the media. I'm very pro media, but I think it's also good to acknowledge there are bad apples in any industry. There are bad intentions in any industry. There are bad stories. Those things exist in the world. I was born into this belief that the world is black and white. There's good and bad, and there's no gray. And the reality is I just covered a story where a guy was wrongfully convicted of murder, sent away for life, a law student, brilliant 23-year-old law student, figured it out, got him out of prison. And I sat down with this guy who just gotten exonerated, and he actually didn't get exonerated. I should take that back. He took an Alford plea, which basically says you plead guilty to a lesser charge to get out that day. So he still has a record, even though he did nothing. I mean, it's just crazy. That's how our world works. And it's just, we were talking about that. And he was like, I never thought I would get charged with a crime that I didn't commit. But the reality is that there were mistakes that were made in the investigation. And that's just the world we live in. So it's a gray world, and how we navigate that is so important. So just going back to your question, Eric, I think we have to be mindful. We ran the story that said this gentleman had been arrested. He had, police say he did this. Here's the reaction from the family now that he's been arrested. They're like, we know he did it. And the court said that he didn't. So I think we have to be so mindful of the weight that we carry. And, some of it is, I see some stories, I'm like, I wouldn't run that. We see these people who, particularly, I'm just thinking of like, I've seen some parents arrested for leaving their kids in the car or things like that, or DUI. And it's like, we don't always know the full story. We don't know if they were running inside of the grocery store because they're hungry and they couldn't afford childcare. There are some things that I think we just have to remember. We don't always know the full story. So I know I'm on such a tangent, but I am really passionate about the weight that this job carries, and convicting someone in a public opinion. And we get a lot of emails of people like, hey, I got arrested. My mugshot's still out. Can you take the story down? Like, they dismissed the charges. But if you search their name, Channel 5, or like any outlet. So, I mean, we are very mindful of that, and it comes with great responsibility, and I never take that lightly.
No, well, your field's lucky to have you with that intentionality and support. And I think a lot of our industries, well, we're in the mental health field, but every industry can have an impact on mental health in the community. But fair is fair. I mean, Tiffany and I get the counseling board emails every quarter, and there are also bad therapists and bad actors. So it is not unique to media. There are some people maybe not doing the work as well, or not following the standards of care. So, yeah, Tiffany, I have just a few more, but I want to make sure I don't steal it. Do you have any questions you wanted to tee up in our conversation?
I don't necessarily know if I have any questions, just more in terms of like, I guess, statement E. But in agreement with that, like, I don't know if we ever as a society have really fully recognized how powerful our pens really are when it comes to, like, sure, we're not physically hurt, but emotional hurt is a lot harder to heal from and recover from than like if someone was to punch you.
Yeah. I just 2 weeks ago, I had a former colleague. She works at a station in Charlotte, she was sitting in the car covering a shooting, and someone shot at their news car. Luckily, it hit the front bumper, but if it was like 2 feet over, it would have struck
Wow.
her. And so she took some time off of work, obviously, and there was sadly a journalist in Florida, I believe it was last year, the year before, that was murdered. He was covering a shooting with his photographer. They both were shot. He ended up passing away. And so I just think about like the danger that we put ourselves in sometimes to do this job. And I would even say for you guys, like you are holding secrets and you're having these really deep conversations. And I sometimes like don't always think about it in the moment, the fear of what I'm doing. I'm just at a scene and I'm not really thinking about it. I'm curious how you guys handle like fear and have that concept of like feeling so called to do something, but knowing there might be some risk associated.
Yeah. Well, life is a risk, and everything has a level of risk tolerance. So, what am I willing to engage in and do? And so that, like in therapy, we talk about like scope of practice. Like, what do you do really well? What's something you should be doing? What's something maybe to let someone else do? Um, but yeah, I think sometimes we think there's no risk situations, there's low or high risk, and so I do think it's like, what level are we taking? But, there's a reason we're all doing the work we're doing, but I do think it kind of falls back to preparation and training, and so, having had, I don't know, however many hundreds of crisis situations now, like, it doesn't get me as it used to because I kind of know what I'm trying to do, but thankfully, I've had really great colleagues and supervisors, and um, even just supports right now. Like Tiffany's one of those people. If I like, hey, I'm kind of struggling with this. Like, what should I do? Like I know Tiffany would call me back in minutes, and have my back. And so just I think working together to serve our communities kind of behind the scenes, so to speak. And so I also think it's needed. We need to be professional secret keepers and to help people. I've been joking with some of my clients that, if I was a plumber and I came to your house and I never left, I'm not a very good plumber. And so one of the things I take with that with therapy is like, we are here to support the seasons of maybe therapy, but very few people will need therapy forever, but it's not a bad thing to go in and get some help. Like I've gone to the chiropractor when it's like, ooh, I'm a little tight. Ooh, I'm a little tight. Should be no difference if, oh, I need a little tune up in therapy. But Tiffany, I'd be curious what you would throw out for this.
Yeah, so I think it depends. Like, I don't want to get too political, but I think like there's a safety risk difference between like me and you working private practice. Like I have to be more aware of time. Like I'm not going to be working at 10 p.m. That's a little bit more dangerous. Versus like if I'm in a group practice where there's more people there, they might work later, things of that nature. I do think as therapists, sometimes we get a little too comfortable and thinking that the people that we work with are, 100% safe. Not to say that no one like coming isn't safe, but like they could easily show up and a session could turn dangerous quickly. And having to make sure you're monitoring, like, are there other people in the building? Like, am I scheduling them at a time that there are other people if there is safety concerns? Like, are we walk a very tight line of like being very trusting and allowing our clients to leave a lot of things with us and also kind of hoping that they like can leave it there and don't have regrets about how much information they did leave with us.
I think that brings up such a good point about boundaries. With our job, we often are like, we'll meet victims' families or sources or things like that where you are like, there's a professional relationship, but then you build comfortability and it can feel more like a friendship. And holding those boundaries can sometimes be like so challenging. Like I often think of some people will text me for sources or text me stories, but other times it gets more like friendly or maybe beyond that. And it's like dialing that back, like having very clear boundaries is, I think sometimes really hard. And I can't speak to like the male experience, Eric, but I can speak to the female experience of
Oh,
sometimes like
it's
very,
way worse to be a woman in the world than to be a man. I'm just like gonna not
it's
mansplain that.
tough. It's tough, and there are some people that you might flirt, and you're like, I know that I could maybe flirt back and like build a better rapport, but I'm quite cold because I think you have to be. I think you have to hold really firm boundaries. I think the one thing you have in this world
Oh,
is your integrity, and when you lose it, you lose it. And so I'm very like big on that. But it is so hard to sometimes find those boundaries, like professional, personal. Like you meet with
oh,
people in the different industries, but then like you see them outside of work, and it's that's like so challenging. Yeah.
I can't even imagine. Like, if Tiffany and I see someone we know, we're not even allowed to acknowledge their presence. If they speak to us, even then, we probably are still going to be like. So sometimes I think of that as a challenge, but maybe I need to start thinking of that as a positive as I'm sitting here with you. I do just want to say your industry, the amount of feedback that people feel to give on things from outfits to body to any of those things, which is completely inappropriate. I really respect what you all do. Tiffany and I have jokes sometimes if like, if my beard and hair level and lighting was giving, if I immediately got comments or something. So I do really respect your guys' industry. It's not easy to be out in front. There's a lot that comes
Oh,
with that being out where anyone can kind of see. So, even as Tiffany and I try to get clients to be out there, we're not in front of the entire city of Cincinnati and the area, or if a story picks up and then getting even more. So just generally thank you for what you do. And maybe this is something you can come back sometime, Lindsay, but I just want to thank you for your time and sharing your experience and expertise. I think this is just so helpful because a lot of our listeners are therapists or people in therapy, but I think it's so interesting to have this other side of the street, so to speak, and what that is like, because I think sometimes we can be in our own little echo chambers of like, well, my industry has it the worst or this. And so I think thank you for just sharing um, the humanness of your job, the toll, the beauty. I know we've talked a little more about the hard, but thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you provide, and thank you for the time. And so, Lindsay, is there any last things just right now that you'd want to close with or add to?
we would not be able to do what we do without the backbone of mental health support. So it really is like such a symbiotic relationship. Without you guys, we couldn't do what we do. I personally go to therapy. I personally have unpaid therapists called my brother, my mother, my father, I have my friends. And so I'm mindful of it's not always accessible for everyone to have a therapist, but having a great support system is so key. And what you guys do it's so beneficial, and it's a ripple that you might not always be able to see. But I'm really grateful for this conversation, and it's great to be able to kind of learn from you guys too, because you have so many great strategies. So thank you for I got to learn, and I got to share, and I'm really grateful for the time.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Hopefully more conversations to come.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. Subscribe to our podcast for more episodes and check out our Patreon for more content. Don't hesitate to contact us on social media if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.